The early morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Washington, D.C. as Marie Thompson adjusted her worn military backpack. At 52, her face carried the weathered look of someone who had seen both battlefield and hardship, yet her eyes still held the unmistakable pride of a United States Air Force veteran. The last few years hadn't been kind to her, but she carried herself with the same dignity she had learned during her 20 years of service. The bitter winter wind cut through her layers of clothing as she made her way toward the local veteran center. 3 years ago, she never would have imagined ending up here. Back then, she had a steady job as a security consultant, a small but comfortable apartment, and even plans to start her own business. But life had other plans. First came the medical bills from her mother's long battle with cancer. Then the economic downturn hit, and her consulting contracts dried up one by one. Before she knew it, she was selling her furniture just to make rent. When even that wasn't enough, she found herself joining the growing number of veterans who called the streets their home. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," called out Robert, the elderly hot dog vendor who always saved her a cup of coffee. He was one of the few people who still addressed her with the respect she'd earned during her service. "Rough night?" Marie managed a small smile as she accepted the steaming cup. The shelter was full again. "But I've handled worse conditions in Baghdad." She took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through her body. "You know me, Robert. I'm too stubborn to let a little cold weather get the best of me." As she stood there, sharing a moment of quiet conversation with Robert, neither of them could have predicted how this ordinary morning would turn into one of the most extraordinary days of Marie's life. The Veterans Center was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. Something felt different today. There were more security personnel than usual, and an air of excitement hung over the usually subdued crowd. Marie noticed several news vans parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. "What's going on?" she asked Linda, one of the regular volunteers who had helped her navigate the complicated world of veteran support services. Linda's eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement. "There's going to be a surprise visit today. Can't say who, but it's someone important. They're going to be discussing new initiatives for homeless veterans." Marie nodded politely, but inwardly sighed. She'd seen plenty of politicians come and go, making grand promises that usually amounted to little more than photo opportunities. Still, she stayed, if only because the center was warm and she could use a break from the cold. As she settled into her usual corner with a worn paperback book, one of the few possessions she'd kept from her old life, she couldn't help but overhear the conversations around her. Other veterans shared stories similar to hers, proud service members who had fallen through the cracks of the system they'd once defended. There was James, a former Navy medic who lost his home after a workplace injury left him unable to continue his civilian job. And Patricia, who had served in the Marines and now struggled with PTSD while trying to raise 2 teenagers on her own. Their stories were different in detail but united by a common thread of sacrifice and struggle. The morning wore on, and the excitement in the room continued to build. Security personnel spoke quietly into their earpieces, and center staff hurried to make last-minute preparations. Marie remained absorbed in her book, a dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea, a story about perseverance that had taken on new meaning in her current circumstances. Suddenly, the room fell silent. Marie looked up from her book to see what had caused the change in atmosphere. The main doors opened, and in walked a familiar figure accompanied by an entourage of security personnel and advisors. It was former President Donald Trump. Marie straightened instinctively, her military training kicking in despite her civilian clothes. Around her, other veterans did the same, some standing at attention out of habit. The room, which moments ago had been filled with casual conversation, now held a charged energy. Trump began making his way through the center, stopping to speak with veterans and staff members. His presence, regardless of one's political views, commanded attention. Marie watched as he listened to stories of service and struggle, noting how he seemed particularly affected by each personal account. She hadn't planned to speak up. What could one more story add to the thousands he must have heard? But as he moved closer to her corner, something compelled her to stand. Perhaps it was the military bearing she'd never quite lost, or maybe it was the accumulated weight of 3 years of hardship seeking release. "Mr. President," she found herself saying, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The words that followed weren't planned or rehearsed, they were simply her truth, spoken from one American to another. She told him about her service, about the pride she still felt in having defended her country. She spoke of the challenges that had led to her current situation, not with self-pity but with the straightforward honesty of a soldier reporting status. As she spoke, she noticed something change in his expression, a shift from political presence to personal engagement. The Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably as their carefully planned schedule began to slip, but Trump waved off their concerns. He pulled up a chair, something none of his handlers had expected, and sat down across from Marie. The cameras that had been following his every move captured this moment, a former president sitting eye to eye with a homeless veteran in a simple metal folding chair. "Tell me more," he said, his usual bold demeanor softened by genuine interest. "I want to understand exactly how someone who served our country for 20 years ends up in this situation." And so, as the morning light streamed through the windows of the Veteran Center, Marie Thompson found herself sharing the story she had held inside for so long. She spoke not just for herself, but for all the veterans who had found themselves fighting battles they never expected on home soil. Little did she know, this conversation would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life but would spark a national conversation about how America treats its veterans. But that was still to come. For now, in that moment, she was simply a soldier speaking truth to power, hoping that someone would finally listen. As Marie continued sharing her story, the usual bustle of the Veterans Center faded into the background. The former president leaned forward, his signature red tie contrasting with the simple surroundings of the center. What had started as a routine campaign stop was transforming into something entirely different. After Mom passed away, the medical bills were astronomical, Marie explained, her hands wrapped around her now cold coffee cup. "I had saved for emergencies, but nobody plans for that kind of expense. Then when the economy took a hit." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "Well, let's just say military training prepares you for a lot of things, but watching your whole life slip away month by month isn't one of them." Trump's usual bold demeanor had given way to something more contemplative. He asked about the specific challenges she'd faced with the VA system, about the gaps in veteran support programs, and about the daily realities of veteran homelessness. His questions weren't the practiced queries of a politician, they were direct, occasionally blunt, but genuine. "The hardest part isn't even the physical discomfort," Marie continued, gesturing to her worn backpack. "It's the invisibility. People walk past you on the street, and their eyes just slide right over you. Sometimes, I wonder if they realize that the person they're ignoring once flew combat missions, once helped evacuate civilians from war zones." Around them, other veterans had gathered, forming a respectful circle. Each face told a similar story of service and struggle. The news cameras continued rolling, capturing every word, every expression, but for once, neither Marie nor Trump seemed aware of their presence. "You know what really gets to me?" Trump interrupted, his voice carrying that distinctive tone that had become familiar to millions. "Here we are, the greatest country in the world, and we've got our heroes sleeping on streets. It's not right. It's not American." He turned to his staff. "Get me more details about her case. All of it. And I want to know about everyone else in this room too." The staff members began scrambling, but Trump wasn't finished. He turned back to Marie, his expression determined. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to tell you something, and I want everyone here to hear it. This isn't about politics. This isn't about photo ops. This is about doing what's right." He stood up suddenly, his imposing figure drawing all eyes in the room. "We're going to fix this. Not with committees, not with studies, not with more paperwork. Real fixes. Real solutions." He gestured to Marie and the surrounding veterans. "These people didn't give us paperwork when we needed them. They gave us action." The energy in the room had shifted. Veterans who had entered that morning expecting nothing more than another day of waiting and hoping now stood straighter, their eyes bright with something that had been missing for too long: hope. Trump's next action surprised even his own staff. He pulled out his phone and made a call, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. "John? Yes, I need you to clear my schedule for the afternoon. All of it. We're having an emergency meeting about veteran homelessness. And get me Secretary Wilson on the line. I want the VA involved in this immediately." Marie watched in amazement as the former President of the United States essentially set up a command center in the middle of the Veteran Center. His staff, initially flustered by the deviation from their carefully planned schedule, quickly adapted to their boss's new mission. "Mrs. Thompson," Trump said, turning back to her, "I want you to be part of this meeting. In fact, I want several of you there." He looked around the room. "We've had enough of experts telling us what veterans need. I want to hear it from the veterans themselves." The next few hours were a blur of activity. What had started as a simple conversation had catalyzed into something much bigger. Marie found herself sharing not just her own story, but helping to articulate the challenges faced by her fellow veterans. She watched as Trump made call after call, his famous negotiation skills now focused on cutting through bureaucratic red tape. By late afternoon, the Veterans Center had transformed into an impromptu situation room. Maps were spread out showing homeless veteran populations across the country. VA representatives had arrived, along with housing authorities and various other officials. But unlike typical government meetings, this one had veterans themselves at the center of the discussion. "You see this?" Trump said to the assembled officials, pointing to Marie. "This is what happens when we forget our promises. This is what happens when we let paperwork become more important than people. Well, not anymore." As the sun began to set outside the center's windows, Marie realized that something truly unprecedented was unfolding. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every veteran who had ever felt forgotten by the system they had sworn to defend. And somehow, her simple act of speaking up had helped spark it. But even as hope began to bloom in her heart, Marie remained cautiously realistic. She had seen promises made before, had watched politicians come and go. Yet something felt different this time. Perhaps it was the way Trump had dismissed his schedule, or how he insisted on hearing directly from veterans. Or maybe it was the way he had looked her in the eye and given his word, not as a politician, but as one American to another. As the meeting continued into the evening, Marie couldn't help but wonder, could this unlikely encounter really be the catalyst for real change? The answer to that question would unfold in ways none of them could have predicted, but one thing was certain: this day would be remembered as the moment when someone finally stopped talking about helping veterans and decided to actually do something about it. The next morning, Marie woke up in a modest but clean hotel room, still trying to process the whirlwind of events from the previous day. After the meeting had concluded late in the evening, Trump had insisted that immediate action begin with the veterans present at the center. He'd arranged temporary housing for all of them while more permanent solutions were being put in place. A band-aid isn't enough, he had declared before leaving the previous night. But it's better than letting the wound keep bleeding while we work on the cure. As she sat on the edge of the hotel bed, Marie's phone buzzed, another new development from yesterday. Trump's team had ensured that all the veterans had working phones, explaining they needed to stay in contact for the upcoming changes. The message was from Linda, the Veterans Center volunteer, sharing links to news articles about yesterday's events. The headlines were everywhere: Trump's surprise Veterans Center visit leads to immediate action, former president launches emergency veterans initiative, homeless veteran story sparks national movement. Marie's conversation had somehow become the catalyst for something much bigger than herself. But it wasn't just media attention. By mid-morning, Marie received another call, this time from a VA representative. "Mrs. Thompson, we've been instructed to fast-track your case," the woman explained. "We have your complete service record here, and there are several benefits you should have been receiving. We're expediting everything." Marie listened, barely able to process what she was hearing. After years of navigating endless paperwork and waiting periods, things were suddenly moving at lightning speed. But she couldn't help thinking about her friends still out there on the streets. Around noon, she made her way back to the Veteran Center, where the atmosphere had completely transformed. The place was buzzing with activity, but this time it wasn't just the usual sad waiting game. Teams of VA officials, housing specialists, and employment counselors filled the rooms. Meeting one-on-one with veterans. "There you are," called out James, the former Navy medic, his face brighter than she'd ever seen it. "Have you heard? They're not just helping us with housing, they're creating an entire program. Trump's team is coordinating with major employers across the country. They want our skills, Marie. They actually want what we can do." Marie watched as veteran after veteran emerged from meetings with renewed hope in their eyes. The change wasn't just in the promises being made, it was in the immediate action being taken. Every veteran was being treated as an individual, their specific skills and challenges being carefully considered. By late afternoon, Marie found herself in a meeting with a corporate hiring manager from a major security consulting firm. "Your experience is exactly what we're looking for," the woman explained, reviewing Marie's service record. 20 years in the Air Force, specialized security training, leadership experience, these are valuable skills. We need people like you. But it wasn't just about employment. Trump's team had assembled a comprehensive support system. There were healthcare coordinators addressing medical needs, counselors helping with PTSD and other mental health concerns, and housing specialists working to secure permanent homes. "The key is sustainability," explained one of Trump's advisors during a group meeting. The president was very clear about this. "We're not looking for temporary fixes. Every veteran needs a clear path forward: housing, healthcare, employment, and ongoing support." As the day progressed, Marie received another surprise. The local news wanted to interview her about the changes taking place. At first, she hesitated, she had never sought the spotlight. But then she thought about all the other veterans still out there, perhaps seeing themselves in her story. "It's not just about what happened yesterday," she told the reporter, her voice steady and clear. "It's about what's happening right now, and what needs to keep happening. Every veteran out there needs to know that change is possible, that their service still matters, that they haven't been forgotten." The reporter asked her about Trump's involvement, clearly fishing for political angles. But Marie kept her focus on what mattered. "This isn't about politics," she said, echoing Trump's words from the day before. "This is about Americans taking care of Americans. This is about remembering the promises we make to those who serve our country." By evening, Marie sat in her hotel room again, overwhelmed by the day's events. Her phone contained job offers, housing applications, and messages from other veterans sharing their own progress. But what touched her most was a personal message from Trump himself. "Mrs. Thompson, your courage in speaking up didn't just change your life. It's changing thousands of lives. This is just the beginning. America takes care of its heroes." As she prepared for bed that night, Marie thought about how much had changed in just 2 days. But she also thought about how much work still needed to be done. The momentum was building, but would it last? Would this wave of change reach all the veterans who needed it? As she drifted off to sleep, she realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, she was ready to face them with hope. 1 week after the fateful meeting at the Veteran Center, Marie stood in front of a mirror in her new business suit, hardly recognizing herself. The transformation wasn't just in her appearance, it was in her eyes, which now held a spark that had been missing for years. She was preparing for her first day at the security consulting firm, but that wasn't the only reason for her early morning preparation. Trump had requested her presence at a major press conference scheduled for later that day. The Veteran Initiative, as it was now being called, had grown far beyond their initial meeting. What had started with one conversation in a Washington, D.C. Veterans Center had sparked a nationwide movement. "You're going to do great," Patricia, her fellow veteran, assured her over the phone. Patricia had also secured a job through the initiative, working as a youth counselor where she could use her military experience to help troubled teens. "Just remember, we're not just telling our stories anymore, we're showing what veterans can do when given a chance." The morning flew by in a blur of orientations and introductions at her new workplace. Her colleagues welcomed her warmly, and Marie found herself easily falling back into the rhythm of professional life. Her military training and experience were seen as assets here, not just lines on a resume. By afternoon, she made her way to the hotel where the press conference was being held. The scene was far grander than she had expected. News crews from every major network, politicians from both parties, and business leaders from across the country filled the room. Trump's team had briefed her earlier about the announcements planned for today. Major corporations had committed to hiring thousands of veterans. Banks were launching specialized programs for veteran homeownership. Healthcare providers were expanding services specifically for veteran needs. But what touched Marie most was seeing how many of her fellow veterans from the center were also present, each with their own success story from the past week. When Trump arrived, he didn't head straight for the podium. Instead, he spent time greeting the veterans personally, asking about their progress, remembering details from their previous conversations. When he reached Marie, his face broke into a genuine smile. "Mrs. Thompson," he said warmly, "you look ready to take over that security firm." Then, more quietly, he added, "Thank you for being brave enough to speak up that day. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to tell the truth." The press conference began with Trump addressing the gathered crowd. "A week ago," he started, "I met a veteran who reminded me what true American spirit looks like. She didn't ask for handouts. She didn't make excuses. She simply told the truth about what our veterans face after serving their country." As Trump detailed the initiative's progress, Marie listened with growing amazement. Over 5,000 veterans had already been connected with immediate housing solutions. Job placements were happening in every state. The VA had streamlined its processes, cutting through years of bureaucratic red tape. But it was the announcement of Phase 2 that caught everyone's attention. Trump revealed partnerships with major tech companies to create a national database connecting veterans with resources and opportunities. Real estate developers had committed to building veteran priority housing in major cities. Universities were offering specialized programs for veteran education and training. "This isn't charity," Trump emphasized, his voice carrying across the silent room. "This is America investing in its best people." These men and women didn't hesitate when their country called. Now it's our turn to answer their call. When Marie was invited to speak, she felt surprisingly calm. Looking out at the sea of faces, she saw not just media and politicians, but fellow veterans whose lives were changing alongside hers. "A week ago, I was invisible," she began, her voice steady. "Today, I stand here not just as one veteran, but as part of something much bigger. This initiative isn't just about giving us homes or jobs. It's about restoring dignity. It's about remembering that every veteran has value, has skills, has something to contribute." The rest of the afternoon was filled with more announcements, more commitments, more plans for expansion. But what struck Marie most was the practical, immediate nature of everything being proposed. These weren't vague promises or distant goals, they were actionable plans with immediate effects. As the day drew to a close, Marie found herself back in her new apartment, a modest but comfortable space she could finally call her own. On her kitchen counter sat her military awards, carefully preserved through years of hardship, now displayed proudly again. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other veterans sharing their own success stories. Opening her laptop, she began working on something that had been forming in her mind all week, a proposal for a veteran mentorship program. Her experience had shown her that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak up, one person willing to listen, and one moment of connection to start a chain reaction of change. As she worked late into the night, Marie realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. She had become part of something larger, something that could potentially help thousands of veterans like her. The woman who had felt invisible just a week ago was now helping to build a bridge for others to cross from despair to hope. 1 month into her new life, Marie sat in her office at the security consulting firm, reviewing the latest reports from her veteran mentorship program. What had started as a late-night idea had blossomed into a full-fledged initiative, supported by both her company and Trump's veteran advocacy team. Her desk phone rang. It was Robert, the hot dog vendor who had given her coffee during her homeless days. "Mrs. Thompson, you won't believe what happened today," he said excitedly. "That veteran resource center you told me about? They helped my nephew. He's been struggling since coming back from overseas, but now he's got a job interview tomorrow." These kinds of calls had become regular occurrences in Marie's life. Her story had inspired others to reach out, to speak up, to seek help. But more importantly, it had inspired people to offer help. The ripple effects of that chance meeting with Trump continued to spread in unexpected ways. Later that morning, Marie visited the Veteran Center, the same one where everything had started. The transformation was remarkable. The once crowded waiting room had been converted into a modern resource hub, with computer stations for job searches, private meeting rooms for counseling, and a dedicated team of support staff. Linda, the volunteer who had become a dear friend, now ran the center's outreach program. "You should see the numbers," she told Marie proudly. "We've helped over 300 veterans in our center alone this month. And it's not just about finding them homes, it's about keeping them housed, employed, and supported." As they walked through the center, Marie spotted a familiar face, a woman veteran who reminded her of herself just a month ago. The woman sat clutching her military backpack, eyes downcast, clearly unsure about seeking help. Marie approached her gently. "I know that look," she said, sitting down beside the woman. "I was sitting in that exact spot a month ago." She shared her story, watching as hope slowly kindled in the other veteran's eyes. By the end of their conversation, the woman was already meeting with a housing specialist. Around noon, Marie received an unexpected call from Trump's office. The initiative had caught the attention of several international veterans organizations, and they wanted her to speak at an upcoming global conference. The girl who once felt invisible was now being asked to share her experience with the world. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some veterans still struggled with the transition, battling inner demons that no amount of external support could easily fix. Marie worked closely with mental health professionals to ensure the program included comprehensive psychological support. She knew from experience that sometimes the hardest battles were fought in the mind. That evening, she attended a dinner hosted by her company for veteran employees and their families. Looking around the room, she saw dozens of lives in various stages of transformation. There was the former Marine who now headed their cybersecurity division, the Army veteran who had just bought his first home, the Air Force technician who was mentoring new hires. During the dinner, Marie's phone lit up with a message from Trump's team. The preliminary data from the initiative was in, veteran homelessness had decreased by 15% in just 1 month. Employment rates among veterans were rising, and VA response times had been cut in half. But it was the personal stories that touched Marie most deeply. After dinner, a young veteran approached her with tears in her eyes. "My brother saw your story on the news," she said. "He's been living in his car for 6 months, too proud to ask for help. Yesterday, he finally went to a veterans center. They're helping him find an apartment and a job. Back in her apartment that night, Marie stood by her window, looking out at the city lights. Her uniform from her Air Force days hung proudly on the wall, alongside her new business suits, symbols of her past and present united. On her desk lay invitations to speak at various events, proposals for expanding the veteran support programs, and thank-you letters from veterans she'd helped. She thought about how one moment, one conversation, one person willing to listen had set all this in motion. Trump's response to her story had been the catalyst, but the real change came from thousands of people choosing to act, to help, to care. Opening her laptop, Marie began working on her speech for the international conference. She wanted to convey not just her personal journey, but the larger truth she had discovered, that every veteran story mattered, that no one who served their country should ever feel forgotten or invisible, and that real change was possible when people chose to see and act rather than look away. As she wrote deep into the night, Marie reflected on how her life had changed in just 1 month. She had gone from sleeping on streets to helping others find their way home. But more importantly, she had discovered that her greatest service to her country might not have been during her military years, but in what she was doing now, helping to build bridges for other veterans to cross from darkness into light. 3 months after that life-changing morning at the Veterans Center, Marie stood at the podium of the International Veteran Support Conference in New York City. The audience included representatives from 20 different countries, all eager to learn about the successful American initiative that had begun with a chance encounter. Real change, Marie began, her voice carrying across the hushed auditorium, doesn't always start with grand plans or massive budgets. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as being seen, truly seen, as a human being. In the front row sat Trump, who had made a special appearance to support the program's international launch. Beside him were business leaders, government officials, and most importantly to Marie, several veterans whose lives had been transformed by the initiative. 3 months ago, I was invisible, she continued, sharing her story not for the 100th time, but with the same authenticity as the first. Today, I stand before you not just as a success story, but as proof that when we choose to act, anything is possible. The statistics she shared were impressive: veteran homelessness down 27% nationwide, employment rates up 33%, VA response times reduced by 60%. But it was the personal stories that captured everyone's attention, stories of veterans who had not just found homes and jobs, but had rediscovered their sense of purpose and dignity. During the conference break, Marie met with international delegates eager to implement similar programs in their countries. A British veteran support coordinator shared how they had already begun adapting the American model. An Australian delegate discussed plans for a Pacific Region Veteran Alliance. The beautiful thing about this program, Trump commented during the afternoon panel, is that it's not about government doing everything. It's about creating partnerships, removing barriers, and letting veterans use their skills and experience. Mrs. Thompson here is proof of what happens when we get out of the way and let our heroes lead. Back at her office later that week, Marie reviewed the latest developments in her veteran mentorship program. What had started as a small initiative at her company had spread to over 50 corporations nationwide. Veterans helping veterans, a simple concept that was proving remarkably effective. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia, who now ran her own veteran support center in Chicago. "You need to see this," the message read, followed by a video link. It showed a group of formerly homeless veterans giving a tour of their new apartment complex, a building specifically designed for veteran housing, complete with on-site support services and job training facilities. That evening, Marie visited her old spot near the Veterans Center where she used to sleep. The area had been transformed into a small park, with a memorial dedicated to service members. As she stood there, Robert, the hot dog vendor, approached with his familiar warm smile. "Look at you now," he said proudly, handing her the same type of coffee he used to give her during her homeless days. "You know, since your story went public, I've been keeping extra coffee and food for any veterans I see. It's not much, but it's everything," Marie finished for him, remembering how much those small kindnesses had meant to her. Sometimes a cup of coffee and a kind word are what get you through the day. Later that night, Marie received an unexpected call from Trump's office. The initiative was being expanded to include active duty service members, helping them prepare for civilian life before they ever faced the challenges she had encountered. They wanted her to help design the transition program. As she worked late into the night on the new program outline, Marie reflected on how far things had come. Her desk was covered with reports, proposals, and letters from veterans around the country. Each piece of paper represented a life in transition, a story of hope, a chance for renewal. The next morning, she was scheduled to meet with a group of corporate leaders about expanding the veteran hiring program. But first, she had a standing breakfast appointment, coffee with Robert at his hot dog stand, where they would watch the morning crowd and remember how a simple act of kindness could change someone's life. A notification popped up on her phone, another success story from the program. A veteran family in Texas had just moved into their new home. The attached photo showed their children playing in their own backyard for the first time. These moments, these small victories, were what kept Marie going, reminding her that the work was far from over. She opened her laptop to fine-tune her presentation for tomorrow's meeting. The title slide read, "Veterans Supporting Veterans, Building Bridges to Tomorrow." Below it was a quote she had heard Trump say during their first meeting, "Real heroes don't just serve once, they keep serving by lifting others up." As the city lights twinkled outside her office window, Marie thought about all the veterans still out there, still struggling, still invisible. But now, thanks to that chance encounter and the wave of change it had sparked, there was hope. Real, tangible, actionable hope. And that, she had learned, was the most powerful force for change. 6 months after the fateful meeting that changed everything, Marie stood in front of a classroom at the newly established Veterans Transition Academy. The faces looking back at her were those of active service members preparing to return to civilian life, the first class of a preventive program designed to ensure no veteran would have to experience what she had gone through. "Your uniform might change," she told them, pacing the front of the room with quiet confidence, "but your value to this country never does. The skills you've learned, the discipline you've shown, the leadership you've developed, these are priceless in the civilian world. The key is knowing how to translate them." The academy was just one of many developments that had sprouted from the initial veteran initiative. Located in a renovated building near the original Veteran Center, it represented everything Marie had dreamed of during her darkest days, a place where military service members could find guidance, support, and concrete pathways to civilian success. During lunch break, Marie received an unexpected video call from Trump. He was touring veteran facilities in California, where the program had taken root with particular success. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted her with his characteristic energy, "you wouldn't believe what they've done out here. They've converted an entire business park into a veteran enterprise zone. Everything from tech startups to manufacturing, all veteran-owned and operated." The success stories kept flowing in from across the country. Patricia's Chicago Center had become a model for urban veteran support, combining housing, healthcare, and employment services under one roof. James, the former Navy medic, now ran a medical training program specifically designed for veterans entering the healthcare field. But what touched Marie most was hearing about the small, everyday victories. Like the veteran mother who could finally afford to throw her daughter a birthday party, or the former Marine who had just received his college acceptance letter. These were the real measures of success: lives rebuilt, dignity restored, futures reclaimed. That afternoon, Marie had a meeting with her expanding team at the security firm. What had started as her personal job opportunity had grown into a dedicated veteran recruitment division, now employing over 200 former service members across multiple locations. "The executives want to know if we can scale this further," her supervisor explained during the meeting. Other companies are asking how we've managed to integrate veterans so successfully into our workforce. They want to replicate our model. As Marie drove home that evening, she passed by Robert's hot dog stand, now expanded into a small cafe that deliberately hired veterans. He had become something of a local legend, known for offering not just food but also connection and community to veterans in transition. "The usual," he called out as she approached. But before he could hand her the coffee, a young veteran in a newly pressed business suit stepped up to pay for it. "You probably don't remember me, Mrs. Thompson," the young woman said, "but 3 months ago, I was sleeping in my car. Saw your story on the news, came to the center. Now I'm working in cybersecurity. Least I can do is buy you a coffee." These moments of connection, of lives touching lives, reminded Marie of how far things had come. The invisible threads that had once bound veterans in shared struggle now connected them in shared success. Back home, Marie reviewed the latest initiative reports. The numbers were impressive: veteran homelessness down 45% nationwide, employment rates continuing to climb, VA efficiency at record levels. But more importantly, the culture had shifted. Veterans were no longer seen as charity cases but as valuable assets to their communities. Her phone buzzed with a message from Trump's team. They wanted her to help launch the next phase of the initiative, focusing on veteran entrepreneurship. The idea was to create a network of veteran-owned businesses, supporting each other and creating more opportunities for their fellow service members. As she prepared for bed, Marie glanced at her old military backpack, now displayed in a corner of her home office. It served as a reminder of where she'd been, but no longer defined where she was going. On her desk lay the draft of her upcoming book, From Invisible to Invincible, A Veteran's Journey Home, which would help fund scholarships for veterans' children. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help others find their way. But tonight, Marie took a moment to reflect on how a single conversation had sparked a movement that continued to grow beyond anything she could have imagined. The lesson was clear: when one person's story touches another's heart, when compassion meets action, when promises become reality, that's when real change happens. And for thousands of veterans across the country, that change had meant the difference between despair and hope, between invisibility and purpose, between surviving and truly living. 1 year to the day after that life-changing morning at the Veteran Center, Marie stood in the rose garden of the White House. The scene couldn't have been more different from where she'd been 12 months ago. Behind her sat hundreds of veterans, government officials, business leaders, and supporters. Before her stood a podium where she would soon address the nation. Trump had arranged this ceremony to mark the 1-year anniversary of the Veteran Initiative, but it had become something much more: a celebration of transformation, resilience, and the power of human connection. A year ago, Marie began, her voice steady and clear, "I was invisible. Today, I stand before you not just as one person who found her way home, but as a representative of thousands of veterans who have reclaimed their lives through this initiative." The statistics were remarkable: veteran homelessness had decreased by 67% nationwide. Employment rates among veterans had reached historic highs. The VA's response time had been reduced by 80%. But more importantly, the culture had fundamentally shifted. Veterans were now seen as valuable assets to their communities, their military experience recognized as unique qualification rather than a barrier to civilian success. In the audience, Marie could see familiar faces. There was Robert, the hot dog vendor whose small acts of kindness had helped her survive her darkest days. His business had grown into a successful chain of veteran-operated cafes. Patricia sat nearby, now directing veteran services for an entire region. James had flown in from his medical training center, where he'd helped hundreds of veterans transition into healthcare careers. This initiative, Trump said when it was his turn to speak, began with one conversation. One person brave enough to speak truth, and another willing to listen and act. But what happened next? That was all of you. Americans coming together to keep our promises to those who served. The ceremony included the announcement of new developments. The Veterans Transition Academy was expanding to 10 more cities. A new veteran entrepreneurship fund would provide startup capital for veteran-owned businesses. The successful housing program would be implemented internationally through partnerships with allied nations. But it was the personal stories that truly captured the day's significance. Like the veteran family who had gone from living in their car to owning their own home and business. Or the former Marine who now ran a tech company employing fellow veterans. Each success story represented not just an individual triumph, but a ripple effect touching countless other lives. After the ceremony, Marie walked through the White House gardens with Trump, reflecting on the year's journey. "You know what makes this different from other programs?" Trump asked, pausing by a rose bush. "It's not just about giving help, it's about restoring dignity. Every veteran who succeeds becomes a bridge for others to follow." Later that evening, Marie returned to the Veterans Center where everything had begun. The building had been transformed into a state-of-the-art resource hub, but it maintained its heart, a place where veterans could find not just help, but understanding and respect. Linda, still coordinating services but now with a much larger team, greeted her with a warm hug. "Remember how crowded and hopeless this place used to feel?" she asked, gesturing to the now efficient and welcoming space. "Now every person who walks through that door knows they're going to find real help." As Marie prepared to leave, a young veteran entered the center, looking as lost as she had felt a year ago. Without hesitation, Marie approached her, just as others had reached out to her in her time of need. "Welcome home, soldier," she said softly, extending her hand. "Let's talk about your next mission." Back in her apartment that night, Marie stood by her window, looking out at the city lights. Her military uniform hung proudly on the wall, next to her business suits and the award she'd received that day. On her desk lay plans for next year's initiatives, letters from veterans she'd helped, and a photo from that first meeting with Trump, a moment that had sparked a movement. She thought about how much had changed in just 1 year. A chance encounter had turned into a national movement, despair had transformed into hope, and invisibility had given way to recognition and purpose. But more importantly, she thought about how much was still possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans needing help, new opportunities to make a difference. But now there was a system in place, a community ready to act, and a nation awakened to its responsibilities toward its heroes. As she drifted off to sleep, Marie remembered something Trump had said earlier that day: "Sometimes the greatest acts of service happen after the uniform comes off." She smiled, knowing that while her military service had ended years ago, her mission to serve her fellow veterans was just beginning. The story of one homeless veteran and a chance meeting had become a catalyst for national change. But perhaps the most important lesson was the simplest: when we choose to see those who feel invisible, when we match compassion with action, when we keep our promises to those who served, that's when real transformation begins. And for Marie and thousands of veterans like her, that transformation had meant the difference between existing and truly living, between being forgotten and being honored, between losing hope and coming home.